We are going to start out this project by using our paper templates and cut out all the different materials that we're going to need for this project. We are also going to start and finish our side gussets. As with all projects, we need to take our paper patterns to the leather. So whether you have the full scale templates on cardstock like you see here, or you've printed them onto regular paper and pieced them together, this will be the first step of the project. The easiest way I find to attach my templates to the leather is using this double-sided tape. Specifically, this is called basting tape. I think it's actually used in like fabric making, but it works perfectly for this application because it's not sticky enough that's going to leave any residue, but it's just sticky enough to hold to the leather. Now on that, the leather that I'm using here is all Rancelli, so it is a chrome tan leather. So this tape doesn't impact the finish at all. There's no residue left on it. There's no marks. There's nothing. If you're using a vegetable tan leather, you're going to want to be careful with the type of tape you use because that could damage the surface. Another thing I want to mention regarding using a leather like Sully, which is a goat leather, you can see the hide here is significantly smaller than a regular veg tan that's maybe coming from bovine leather. The size of these hides is going to have an impact on your layout. So you can see here how I've laid out each piece. It's maximizing the space as much as I can, but also taking into account the waves and the variation in the actual leather. So some of these parts are lying near the edge of the leather where there's a bit of a wave. Now that's not going to be an issue because I'm going to be adding all the reinforcement, and once it's stick together, it's not going to be a problem. This is definitely something though you're going to want to consider when you're laying out your parts, to make sure that you're not laying a part out on a section of the leather that's going to cause you problems down the road. Something I like to do to avoid the templates coming loose or shifting is doing all of the cuts on my right hand side first. So I did cut both of the right hand sides of that pattern, then I turn the leather. So now I'm going to do that one right hand cut. I'm doing the second one. Now I turn the leather, cut off this small strip, move to the bottom of the next one. This just avoids any possibility that when I'm moving the leather around to cut out a single piece, that the other pieces are going to come off and then I'll have to line everything up again. Something I like to do, maybe it's not necessary, but it avoids the templates coming loose. You'll see here when I stick the inside pocket down that it's pretty close to that edge of the leather. So I'm just aligning that up, making sure it's not going to land on any points that are an issue, knowing that the bottom of this pocket is going to get folded over and stitched along the whole way. Any issues and little folds in the leather that might occur on the bottom of this pocket, I know are not going to be an issue. So there's a case where I made the call to put it really close to the edge, even though there's a bit more wave than I would normally like. Now these little notches that I'm cutting out on the bottom of the pocket, this design may change slightly by the time I get to the pocket. I've been thinking about an alternative way to make this pocket style, and I think I've come up with one that's less bulky and a little bit easier to stitch together. It does not change the shape of this and the overall dimension. It just changes this little cutout. So once we get to that part in the project, you may see that this front pocket looks a little bit different. If you've purchased the plans prior to this episode being posted, then you will have received the updated plans automatically. If you haven't purchased the plans yet, the new pocket design will be included. That's assuming I actually make this change. Here's a quick tip on getting perfect alignment. Put your knife against the edge of the paper template, bring your ruler up to it, and then line up the far edge of the ruler with your template. That ensures that you'll be lined up properly and you won't cut off of your template or into your template. You can see the result there. Pick this one up from the woodworking world and it applies perfectly when cutting out your templates. So these are all the pieces in your main thickness, the 1.2 mil that you're going to need. And these are all the pieces in the 0.8 millimeter or the lining weight that you'll need for the project. I then jump over to my secondary leather, which in this case is also 0.8, and this one's in the malachite. Oliver and Sully, the stuff you saw before was the jade. So this is my handle, my sangles, my clochette, and the bag charm, as well as the crossbody strap, which I have not cut out yet at this point in the process. To cut out a divot like this, I start by cutting the two short ends, and then I come in from the corner, go most of the way, flip it around, and then come in from the opposite corner. That ensures that I get that knife right into the corner and I get a nice crisp corner. And here are all the pieces for my secondary leather, excluding the crossbody strap, which again, I have not cut out yet at this point in the project. Then we're jumping over to our salpa or our bonded leather. One thing to note about this is there's one side of this that seems a little bit slicker than the other side, and my tape would not stick to it. So keep that in mind. I'm not sure if that's the case with all bonded leather, but one side was super slick. And these are all the reinforcement pieces of the bonded leather. And last but not least, our brio. This is the very bottom support of the bag that's going to support the bag feet. Tape does not stick to this stuff, so I just kind of did a freehand and it worked. And here is a quick little layout of all of the different pieces you need to complete this bag. As you can see, there is quite a few different pieces, to say the least. At this stage, I'm actually just now organizing all of the different materials into each of the parts of the bag. So the handle, the bottom, the sangles, the front, the back, and then again the crossbody strap, which I have not cut out just yet. The side gussets are fairly simple. They have the exterior and the lining pieces. So we can take the paper template off of the lining leather and mark our guidelines for our skiving. You could also see how easily that template peeled off of the leather, which is why I really like using that basting tape. Now you can either use your guide to mark in 9mm, or you could just measure it. Either one is obviously going to work, but the patterns do include that measurement for your convenience. One trick I've been doing when skiving these long edges is putting some basting tape down on the tile and then sticking my piece onto that. This means that the tape is going to hold that piece nice and flat, and I don't have to hold it and try to skive at the same time. Doing a nice bevel skive of 9 mils can be a little bit tricky if you're not used to it, so I break it out into 2 steps. Step 1, I skive right out to 0, only 3mm wide. This makes it a lot easier to get that edge right out to 0 versus trying to estimate that angle over the full 9 mils. Once I have that initial steep angle, I then come back to my 9mm mark and then go right out to the edge. And you can see my blade there. It's coming right out to the very edge that I've skived to 0. I find this is the easiest, most accurate way to get a nice smooth, even skive when you're out to 9mm or 10mm. Shorter than that, it's a bit easier, but a wider skive like this by hand, I do this 2-stage technique. Also remember that the lining is has 3 mil of trim allowance. So if you end up skiving a little too deep and you cut through your lining, then you're going to be okay because there's an extra 3mm of room. So you don't have to go exactly to 0. If you end up skiving a bit deeper, that's fine as long as it's not past the 3mm. You'll see in a bit where I do end up skiving too deep and the edge isn't nice and straight like you see it here. The last step is to run my blade straight along the edge from my 9mm mark right out to 0. This creates a nice flat so that the bevel is nice and even. And then before each new piece, I will always freshen up the blade on the strop. With your gusset linings skived up, you can go ahead and mark the center on the top and the bottom. This is going to help you with alignment when you glue the exterior piece to the lining. You can also go ahead and make those same marks on your main piece, mark in the center for the top, bottom, the sides. I also mark where those arrows are. That's going to come in handy later when we assemble the bag, because those arrows are going to match up to marks on the front and the back panels. Gluing up these panels is fairly straightforward. I'm using EcoStick 1816B. It's a water-based glue. It's my personal favorite. The only thing, I got mine from Canadian Exotic Leather. So if you're in Canada, that's where you should get some. So yeah, this is fairly straightforward. Just spread the glue evenly, let it tack up, stick the pieces together. There's 3 millimeters of trim allowance, so make sure your center marks line up and stick everything together. With your pieces all glued up, you'll want to get yourself a roller to make sure these things are nice and flat. I like the plastic roller ones versus the metal one. Even with that rolling, you're going to want to make sure your edges are nice and sealed. You can see right here, this little bit, there's a bit of a gap. So I'm just going to press that down with my fingers to make sure it's nice and sealed. With those all glued up, you can now grab your front template and place it back on to your gusset. Now with your templates that you don't need anymore, you can see here that that double-sided basting tape peels off pretty easily. So now you can reuse that template and it's good to go for the next project. Now you can start marking out your stitch spacing. So these plans currently, as of this video, are 3.38 millimeters. By the time you're watching this, I may have released a different stitch spacing. So if that's the case, make sure you're using the plans that match your stitch spacing. It's not necessary to mark out all the holes like I am doing here. If you want, you can just mark the corners and then take this template off and punch them out as normal with your irons. However, I like marking out every 9th hole or every 5th hole, and then using my iron to line up those holes, and then I just punch all the way through. It helps ensure that the stitch spacing stays consistent. Sometimes you can position the iron slightly off, so by the time you get to the end of your run, you're off by 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter. That can start having a visual impact on the final piece. So for me, it's really important to use these marks from the template as almost guideposts. So as I'm punching those holes, I know I'm staying on so that my stitch spacing works out exactly as planned. Having these marks around the holes where the sangles go through is especially helpful, because working around curves and on these angles, sometimes your stitch spacing can get off. So I mark every single one of these to ensure when I punch, everything is going to work out exactly as planned. Yes, this takes a bit of extra time, but I think the accuracy that it provides to the end project is worth the extra minute or two it takes to mark out each hole. I'm going to use this oblong punch to punch out the holes for the sangles, and it's held with a magnet to this little foot adapter for my arbor press. Got some magnets drilled in there so it holds it in place, makes it a bit easier to punch those holes. This is from a punch set I got on Amazon. It is nothing fancy, but they are really sharp, so it works really well. So I just do my best to line everything up, press it down, make sure everything is as straight as I can get it, and punch through. And then I line up the punch with the other end and finish the cut. Now is a good time to get these initial edge creases in place. We'll end up doing this a couple times after we punch the holes, and then once more just before we start edge painting, just to make sure we get a nice, crisp, solid edge crease. Doing the inside edge creases on these elongated holes can definitely be a bit tricky. So I found the best way to do this is work in short little segments around that curve. So you can see I'm just doing a few millimeters at a time while I turn the piece, and then work my way nice and slow around that curve. Now I'll do this with really light pressure to make sure I don't slip, and then I'll just go over it multiple times, 3, 4, 5 times, as much as I need until that crease is nice and defined. To punch the corner holes, I recommend getting these 1 millimeter round punches. They work extremely well in any 90-degree corner situation. The rest of this process should be fairly straightforward. You're just going to punch all the holes, making sure everything is lining up with those hole marks that you made when you had your paper template attached. The other reason we did our crease line prior to punching is that it gives us a nice visual reference in keeping our stitch and chisel nice and straight. You'll notice there's no corner punch at the bottom. That's very intentional. That will get explained once we join the gusset and the front and the back panels. To keep things as repetitive as possible, and I say that seriously, I punch all of the same holes on each hole first, and then move my piece and do the second set of holes. So when it comes to stitching up the elongated holes, I would suggest doing any back stitching at the bottom. Visually, it's going to give a little bit more weight to the bottom of these holes versus putting the double stitches or back stitching on the side or along the top. So I'm starting in the bottom holes. I'm going to stitch all the way around and then just overstitch the three spaces at the bottom. So you can see here I've come to the end or the start of my stitch run, and now I'm just going to keep stitching over the bottom three stitches, and that'll make sure my back stitching is nice and balanced. To seal these threads, I just add a bit of glue before pulling them tight, and then once I do that, that glue will spread into the layers of leather and seal everything nicely. Then just snip that thread nice and close and use your awl to poke any excess thread back into the hole. And then using my pliers, I will flatten down that thread. Now you can't use these pliers obviously on the inside stitches because the pliers aren't long enough, so we'll hammer those ones down. Once those elongated holes are all stitched up, you can go ahead and stitch along the top edge, starting this right at the corner. I don't do a back stitch. I just run a single line all the way to the end, and then I'll show you how you finish that off so there's no back stitching on either end of this stitch run. So once you get to the end, you're going to use your awl to separate those two layers of leather. And in the very last corner hole, you're just going to thread the needle through, coming up in between the two layers of leather. Then you just need to tie a double knot, add some glue, and then stick that corner back together. And that is how you hide a stitch run without any backstitching. So now your two panels are glued up, stitched up, and ready for some edge painting. Now with everything stitched up, you can go ahead and trim off the excess lining from the top of each of the side gussets. If needed, you can lightly sand down that trimmed edge just to make sure everything is nice and flush and even for the edge paint. After you've sanded down this edge, double check that your crease line is still nice and crisp. If not, go ahead and touch it up now. Getting the edge paint into these elongated holes can be a bit of a trick. I suggest just applying that edge paint sparingly and working through it, taking your time, not loading up the end of your awl too much because it's quite easy to obviously spill over onto the face, and we want to avoid that as much as we can. I'm working with a matching edge paint color, so the line between my edge paint and the leather is hidden quite well. If you're using a dark colored edge paint on a light colored leather, you very much have to be precise about applying this edge paint. so that it doesn't spill over and ruin the piece. Once the elongated holes are all painted up, you can move to the top edge. I stick with my awl for this. You could use one of those roller pen applicators. I prefer using the awl. In total, I'm able to get these edges fully finished with just 2 coats. Normally when I apply edge paint, it takes 3 coats to get a nice finished, smooth, clean surface. But in this case, I'm using a light colored edge paint, so I'm able to get it done in just 2 coats. Once the edge paint is nice and dry and hardened up, which in my case took about 20 minutes or so, I give it a light sand with 220. The dry time for paint might be very different for you depending on temperature and humidity, so your dry times may vary slightly from mine. What you're looking for is obviously a dry, smooth, hard surface. If you run your finger along it and it feels wet or it feels tacky, it's not going to be dry yet, and it's going to be too early to start sanding. The edge paint I'm using is Giardini, so if you're using Vernis, Uniters, or something else, it's also going to have a big impact with how quickly that paint dries. After the first coat of edge paint, you're not looking for a perfect uniform surface. You're going to have little divots and low spots in the edge paint. That's perfectly fine. You just want to sand it until it's nice and smooth and even. The second layer of edge paint is going to fill in any little divots that might still be there. Now, ideally, you're going to sand that surface so it's perfectly flat, so that when you apply the next layer of edge paint, it's not having to fill in any divots. In my experience, though, you can get away with it being 90% flat, and the edge paint will take care of filling in any small little gaps that might be there. That's the thing that kind of comes with experience, so I do recommend making sure that surface is perfectly sanded flat before you apply that next layer. Now that might mean, depending on how smooth the surface was to start, that you remove a good portion of that first layer of edge paint. This is also going to be more likely if you don't apply your edge paint evenly. So do your best to make sure you're applying that edge paint in a nice even layer and it's not bumpy. This is one reason I like using the awl to apply the edge paint. I find I can get a nice even application of the edge paint. On the final layer of edge paint, I jump up to 600 grit sandpaper to smooth out and refine that final edge. To finish off the edge and add a bit of protection as well as a bit of polish, I use clear Columbus wax swiped onto the side with a coarse canvas cloth to buff it out. That wraps up episode 1. At this point, you should have all of your pieces cut out. The only thing I did not show in this video was cutting out the long strap. I will do the strap in its own dedicated video. Along with all of your pieces, you should now have the 2 side gussets done and ready to go, except for final trimming of the lining. If you haven't already, head over to my website, norfolkhandmade.com, to download the plans for this project. Thank you everybody for watching. We'll see you in episode 2.